Right, may I have my attention, please? Raise your hand if you can hear me okay. If you can hear me okay. How about those guys over here in the corner? Can you hear me okay? All right, thank you so much. Welcome. Those of you who just came in, my name is Enrique Gomez. I am president of the Jackson County NAACP, and I'd like to welcome you to our fundraiser salad dinner. Thank you so much for coming. So we have a few announcements, essentially what's going on. We have some bidding over there for a silent auction. Thank you so much for your generous bids as well. We are going to be closing the bids at 8:15 tonight, 8:15. So hopefully there's going to be some time after the talk today by Dr. McCrae to come in and take a look at that and see if you are going to get the thing that you really want. So thank you so much. Another thing, we at the NAACP have a couple of things that are going on. We have, for instance, on August 11, we have the Highlander Center trip. We are organizing a trip to the Highlander Center. Raise your hand if you know what the Highlander Center is. Not everybody is, but do you know who Rosa Parks was? Yeah. Do you know that Rosa Parks was not just a lady that got tired one day and didn't want to change seats? You realize that way before, years before she actually did that move, before it began to coordinate, she was a secretary of her local NAACP branch. And she has spent years being trained as a nonviolent activist at the Highlander Center in Tennessee. So what we want to do is to connect with that history. So if you are interested in this trip, if you could please contact Avram. Avram, raise your hand. He's the man behind the camera. So say hi to Avram. Hi, Avram. Okay, there we go. All right, and by the way, is this going to be streamed in Mountain Stream TV? Is that right?
It's not being live streamed, but it will be recorded. It is being recorded and will be posted.
All right, so if you want to see this again, if you go to mountainstream.tv in the next few days, hopefully you'll be see a link so you can enjoy and share today's talk. Okay, I want to take a moment to urge you guys to join the NAACP. We do have membership forms if you are not a member already. Let's see, we have some membership forms. Joyce over there up in the front desk, she has some things as well. Thank you so much. Also, one of the things that we've been very active with is the movement to reunite the families. We had a tremendous event with 300 people that showed up over in Franklin, just over the hill from here. Not this weekend, but the weekend before, am I right? So this is the issue here is the forced separation of families who are petitioning asylum at the border. And we have this weird situation, bizarre situation in this country where we have child detention centers, including tender age centers. And I am told, because I listen and keep up with the news, that the government today failed to meet the deadline to reunite the families of children less than 5. So we're talking about several hundred kids that are still separated. If you want to be part of this, we are still collecting petitions. So up in front, Joyce over there, I think that we have petitions as well. And Dan, is there anything that you want to say about that?
It's a travesty, and we need everybody to let your Congress people in North Carolina. We've got Richard Burr and Tom Tillis, and locally we also have Mark Meadows, so please let them know that is unacceptable. Those children need to be reunited with their families immediately.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that hard work. Okay, so petitions up there for you to sign. I want to take a moment to actually recognize people who have donated work for a silent auction as well as for today's dinner. I would like to recognize and thank Jill Markham, Susan Phillips from Flying Cat Studio, Carolyn Hopper, Charles Dayton, Velda Davis, Linnell Burkett, Sharon Thompson, Chris Wilcox from City Light Bookstore, Mutt Dabbers Pottery, Larry Thompson, and Will Harvey Cakes and Catering. Am I missing anybody? Anybody, any of our caterers, we good, okay? And I would like to thank members of our branch and volunteers that made it possible for us to enjoy this wonderful meal today. I'd like to thank Cindy Faircloth-Smith, our secretary over there. We have Sharon Thompson. Let's wait until the end to thank them with an applause. Sharon, where are you? Is Sharon here? There you are, Sharon. How about Lynn, Ellen, Marshall, Dan, Lucy, Martha, Carolyn, Marge, Joyce, Roy, and Myrtle? Am I missing anybody else? Please give all these volunteers and elves a big round of applause for and thank them for what they've done for us. Thank you so much. Okay, yesterday was the 150th anniversary, of the passing of the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment that granted citizenship to the sons and daughters of slaves in this country, and as well as show of recognition of the personhood of any number of individuals as well. We, in the work of the NAACP, founded in 1909, have based a lot of our work from the very beginning based on the 14th Amendment. And you wouldn't think that one of these amendments that was passed during the period of Reconstruction would be the subject of attack, but it is. As a matter of fact, at the last state conference of the NAACP, you have Leonard Susskind, who wrote a book on, called Blood and Politics, that talked about how people, white nationalist groups, have mobilized to find ways in which they could repeal the 14th Amendment. So as a result of this, people across the country, several branches of the NAACP, decided to have an event to actually take a moment to recognize the importance of this amendment, this idea of citizenship, birthright citizenship, and nationhood, which is an important part of who we are as a nation. So that's an important part as well. All right, any other announcements? Anything else? Okay, well, just take a moment to introduce my today's speaker. We have Dr. Elizabeth Gillespie McCrae, Libby McCrae, who authored the book Mothers of Massive Resistance. Do we have copies to give, or to sell? City Lights, of course, which is where I got my own very own copy. Yeah, when I was just reading this, and truth be told, I haven't gone through all of this stuff, this book, but I certainly have gone through quite a bit of it. There is this mystery for me, a mystery for a long, long time. It went along like this. Long time ago, we're talking about 2001, long time ago. I was a student, a graduate student at the University of Alabama, where I was president of the Graduate Student Association. And one of the things that they put me in, I mean, really what I wanted to do is get healthcare for TAs and RAs and all of that. That was my thing. But because I was student leader, I was placed in something called the Student Leadership Council. Student Leadership Council. Why did we have a Student Leadership Council? Because at some point in the history of that great university, the student government organization got banned. Why was it banned? Because you have this organization, secretive organization called the Machine, that worked really hard to put people in student government and essentially blocked, in a few instances, the election of the first African American student body president. Amongst other things that they did, which are rather nefarious, they worked really hard to put a whole set of rules to keep the first African American homecoming queen from being elected. And those rules, of course, not having the word race in any of those rules, the word race in any of this language that they had, was known informally as the Black Queen Exclusion Rules. So it was very, very, very egregious, very egregious. So they banned it, and of course they brought it back eventually. But because of that, they had to establish the Student Leaders Council, and I was kind of roped into this. And one of the tasks I was given at the time is to come up with a student creed, What's also known now as the Capstone Creed. What's that all about? Essentially, it's just certainly a note that you take as a freshman as to how you're going to conduct yourself. But I was part of these meetings in which we would help to define as students what that creed was all about. Well, one of the things I wanted to do, for instance, is that, well, we need to have a diversity statement. You know, we will show like that we are going to respect and honor and recognize diversity. This is part of our identity as a university. That's one of the things I did. And I encountered opposition from the weirdest place that I did not expect. So we're talking about essentially this white female leaders over there that essentially organized an opposition from having this the word diversity being included this. And I was taken aback, and my jaw like dropped. It's like, are you going to make a stand on that hill? Why? I mean, you would think that would be something that would be a no-brainer, sort of like a basic thing. But essentially, the logic of that argument kind of went along like this. Diversity is political, and politics are not nice. So let's not go there and do that. But the thing that got me is that this were one of those particular students I remember was a national merit scholar. It was someone who was obviously being groomed for positions of leadership in government or industry and all of that. And I just didn't know how to respond. I was just confused. Because I have gotten to the idea that when we talked about politics and diversity, that I could comfortably count on my friends, my colleagues who were white females, college educated, and all that. I could count that, but turns out that that was not the case. So that came to the conclusion, it's like, oh boy, there are things about the South that I clearly don't understand. There are things that I really need to learn something about, and I'm still learning about that, all of that. But here in the NAACP, what we've done, especially in the last few years, is that we have worked really hard to explore intersectionality and build a fusion movement that involves both, say, blacks and whites in the rural South. We're talking about Latino immigrants, we're talking LGBT folks, we're talking about people from various religious traditions coming in, as well as people that don't identify as being religious, but still believe in this moral arc of the universe. People who are advocates for voting rights, for protection of minorities and immigrants, people who are interested in criminal justice reform. People are talking about reform of education, making healthcare available and affordable to the vast majority, if not all Americans. So this is a part of building this fusion coalition means that we actually have to understand the intersection between race and gender, amongst other things as well. So with that, I would like to introduce today's speaker. We have Libby McCrae. Is the author of the recent book, Mothers of Massive Resistance, White Women and the Politics of White Supremacy, a book that examines the multiple ways that white women worked in local and national communities to maintain racial segregation and to create a politics where white supremacy mattered. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC World Histories, Public Schools First, and numerous radio shows. He has just finished her 18th year teaching history at WCU, Western Carolina University, where in addition to teaching modern U.S. history, African American history, and the history of the Jim Crow era, she has helped train public school educators, co-founded with Alex McCauley the Appalachian Oral History Project, which is a partnership with Smoky Mountain High School, and is the faculty supervisor for AT&T's North Carolina African American Heritage Calendar. So with that, I would like to ask you to please welcome Dr. McCrae to the podium. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I can't decide what, okay. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Enrique, for inviting me. I'm honored to talk to you tonight as you celebrate the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment. There's no better place to begin to consider the path and perils of the United States journey. Oh, sorry. Okay. Do I need to start? Okay. There is no better place to begin to consider the path and perils of the United States journey to equality than a meeting of the NAACP. For many Americans, we are taught to understand our nation's history as one of steady progress. There's plenty of evidence for that. When we look at the past and we see the abolition of slavery, the expansion of the vote to non-landowners, to African American men, to women, to 18-year-olds, we can also point to the rise of minimum wage and maximum hours, the expansion of marriage equality, the proliferation of public schools for all, the advent of workplace health and safety regulations, Democracy, we can say, works not as quickly as some of us want and too quickly for others, like the woman that Enrique met. But we tend to point to those trailblazers and activists and politicians who conducted those campaigns and celebrate sort of the path to greater equality. For too many Americans, although I think less now than a few years ago, we think that some of those battles are over, right? That equality has been achieved. But democracy and democratic gains, history tells us, are much more tenuous, and a fact that certainly we recognize in our current political climate. This is particularly true of the 14th Amendment. And that's just section 1 of the 14th Amendment. There's 5 sections. I'm not sure until I started preparing for this talk that I had ever read all 5 sections. But there are 5 sections. The 14th Amendment has more words than the Bill of Rights combined. Right? It is our longest amendment, and arguably the amendment that set a real foundation for the nation, right? If the Bill of Rights guaranteed that individuals would be spared from encroachments of the federal government, the 14th Amendment said state governments couldn't do that either, right? And so it has been from 1868, right on the heels of the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, the most, many scholars would say, important amendment to the Constitution. But from the very beginning, it was contested. And it has been a battle of people trying to chip away at ideas of national citizenship, of equal protection under the law, of due process for all people. You don't have to be a citizen to get due process, according to the 14th Amendment. And that as soon as the amendment was passed, people began to chip away, recognizing the revolutionary and radical claims that the 14th Amendment made. Harvard law professor Tamika Nagin-Brown has said, in every generation, the meaning of the 14th Amendment hangs in the balance. And that was as true in 1868 as it is today. In fact, the first major court case that interpreted the 14th Amendment was decided a mere 5 years after its passage and chipped away at the clause of privilege and immunities. Equal protection under the law gave way 30 years later to the policy of separate but equal that was decided in 1896. And shortly after that case, Plessy versus Ferguson, the NAACP was founded, immediately bringing cases to the courts that challenged the 1896 decision. And the first case, I hope I'm right on this, in this crowd, the first case that let me see if this works. Can I go over there? Lucy, will you go over there and click for me? The first case that the NAACP took to the courts was about residential segregation, right? Which is beyond the purview of even the segregation laws in the South, right? The practice of selling homes to only one race of people and denying other people the chance to buy those homes, which is a policy, not a law. And so the NAACP was founded shortly in the aftermath of the rise of racial segregation and continued to try to make the 14th Amendment honor what it was meant to do in 1868. So if other people could point to the 14th Amendment and celebrate the nation's commitment to equality, the NAACP knew early on, and for good, that the 14th Amendment had to be continually protected, right, through activism. But just as the NAACP fought to make the federal government honor equal protection and due process, they were opposed in 1909 and thereafter by a whole list of institutions and people. The Supreme Court, President Woodrow Wilson, Congress, state legislators, some business owners, white Southerners who held on to a Confederate past, all white juries. And then there was vigilante violence, intimidation, coupled with grassroots organizations and local efforts to emerge and sustain a nation that adhered to separate but equal and white supremacist politics. So I think it's important for us to remember that while people were pushing for equality, and you all know this, right, that there were, at this point, the balance was in favor of those who were pushing against equality, who were trying to limit the scope of the 14th Amendment, who did not want a nation where people from all cultures had equal rights. And for a long time, they seemed to be winning, and the people fighting for the 14th Amendment seemed to be struggling against a pretty serious front, right? A pretty serious group of people opposing it. I wrote this book about one group of people, white segregationist women in the South and across the nation, who did just that, who fought for decades to support and sustain a system of racial segregation, to limit the scope of the 14th Amendment. Now, we often think of those women as hanging out in the South. It would be easier to fix that problem if they were limited to one region, right? But they are across the nation, and they work in all different ways. So these women supported a system that denied educational opportunity based on race, that kept wages low for black workers, and thereby kept wages low for white workers. A system that denied black Southerners access to libraries, to transportation, to certain jobs, and denied them opportunities to participate in a free market. The system was frankly undemocratic, but these white women, right, and I'm talking about sort of activist white women, waged their battles in 4 arenas: public welfare systems, so as social workers, as midwives, as nurses, as juvenile probation officers, in public education, in electoral politics, and in the stories they told their children and the larger public about race, history, and rights. So you might ask, why would you want to hear about these people? Right? Folks opposed to what I imagine are the very things that I support and that you support. We're faced today, however, with very real consequences of not confronting the reality of how white women vote, of how racial politics are shaped and sustained. Now, not all white women. I'm not talking about all white. So I'm going to, rather than saying white segregationist women every time, that's who I'm talking about, and I'm going to condense it. Okay? So I'm going to tell you 3 stories from my book, 3 different places and 3 different moments in time that sort of illustrate the kind of work white women did. And the reason, you won't, whatever, you might not find these as exciting as I do, but the reason I'm telling you this is that we often think that the battle to sort of make the 14th Amendment what it should be, and is waged at these higher levels of the nation, right? And it is in the Supreme Court, and it is in Congress, but it is also on the ground in our local communities. And if we're going to protect it, it's everyday people that have to do that, because it's everyday people that are challenging the 14th Amendment. And so you can read lots of other books about like congressmen and presidents and Supreme Court justices. But I'm going to talk about sort of on the ground how people in our communities and our neighbors and the people we love and the people we don't love, waged war against the 14th Amendment. So I'm going to talk about a 1930s effort to demonize a woman who crossed the color line, a white woman. A 1950s effort to remake the Supreme Court nomination process. and a 1960s and 70s effort among women across the nation to sort of disguise their commitment to white supremacy with a colorblind language, and we're going to talk about busing in that instance. But first, and maybe I'll walk over there and see if I can do it. I want to show you some pictures just so that you can have a sense of who we're talking about. And this is one of the ways I came to the book. I'll talk about that in a second. Will you go on? Will you just run through? So when you look at pictures from the civil rights movement, the long civil rights movement, a lot of time, right, we hear about George Wallace and the KKK, but when we look at pictures, it's women. Will you stay on that for a second, please? Back one. Yes. Okay, so you see, this is a white woman in New Orleans trying to take her child to William Frantz Elementary that had been integrated. And it's her neighbors, people that had come to the house for dinner, that had played with her children, right, who are trying to prevent her from sending her child to school, right? And we're familiar with them yelling at Ruby Bridges, right, to keep her from going to school. But they also, right, were trying to make sure that their community held to the color line. And that meant that you punished not only African American families, but you punished white families too. Now, African American families suffered far more than the one white woman who was trying to take her child to school. But it is this like, it's a wholesale effort that affects lots of people, right? You can run through some more, I think. Yeah, so here's a picture of a woman in 1960, a girl. This is the one thing I sort of feel bad about in the book, right? She's like 17 and she writes an essay, and the prize was $500. It would pay for 4 years of tuition at the University of Mississippi. I think about what I might have my child write about to cover her college tuition, right? And I hope I would be more conscious and socially aware than this. But she wrote this as a high school senior, and the topic was why I believe in the social separation of the races of mankind. This is 6 years after the Brown decision, right? 6 years after schools were supposed to be integrated. And I think she's probably still alive, so I hope she never reads this book. Right, I'm like, oh, I don't ever want to meet Mary Rosalind Healy. Later, right, as the civil rights movement took off in the 60s and it was clear that the segregationists were losing the larger legal battle, they created other organizations, right, that accomplished similar goals but didn't seem as overtly racist or white supremacist. So Patriotic American Youth is one of these. It's founded and recruits people from Girls and Boys State to come, and yes, right, I want my kids to go to Girls and Boys State, but I'm not letting them go. Follow up here. And then, Enrique, I don't know what else is. Okay, this is Boston, right, not Birmingham, in the 1970s with women protesting busing. You'll go to the next one. New York, anti-busing protest. You probably can't see from the back, but it's a lot of women in there. Whites have rights too. I don't know if this should make us feel better or worse about Charlottesville, but clearly the riot in Charlottesville did not come out of nowhere. And if, Enrique, if you'll go on to the... So this is Charlotte, North Carolina. After this one, Mecklenburg decision that tried to integrate through busing. So you see young children, right, in the 70s who are 14, which makes them not that old now, protesting. And then if you'll go to the next one. And this is children in Boston. Same year, roughly, right, doing the same thing. So I think it's important to remember that this is a national phenomenon, right? It is most vibrant in the South in the 50s and 60s, but then it spreads out and there are allies across the nation. Okay, So you can keep, anyway, if you get bored, you can look up the pictures and tell Enrique to go back to one of the others, right? You can do what you want. But I think you get the sort of sense of, that's a long durée. The first slides that had the cards were from the 1920s, when you had to, as a midwife, you were required by law to turn in the race of the baby. And you had two choices in the South, white or black. In most states, Native American identity had been erased, right? Because the idea was that Native Americans had intermarried with Africans and African Americans over the centuries, and so there were no true Native Americans. So if you weren't a federally recognized tribe, but you still claimed a Native identity, you were moved in the 1920s, first in Virginia and then across the nation. You were moved into the black category, and then there was a white category. So that's the beginning. I don't know if it's a coincidence that it's 4 years after women get the right to vote that the first one-drop rule passes, but the one-drop rules came late, and they came after women's suffrage. I mean, they came after women got the right to vote. Okay, so that's probably too much history for right now. But, so we'll start with these examples. In the late 1930s and 40s and through the 1950s, Eleanor Roosevelt became the white woman demonized for crossing the color line. Even across the South, where people loved Franklin Roosevelt, they were vehemently opposed, many white women, to Eleanor Roosevelt. They damned the First Lady for crossing racial lines, for stirring up racial strife, for damaging America's standing in the world by supporting the United Nations and the Human Rights Convention. Her sins for white segregationist women were many, and they could track them through the First Lady's column, My Day. So she wrote a daily column called My Day, and a lot of white women who were segregationists and journalists in the South responded to My Day in their columns. In 1942, Eleanor Roosevelt came to Salisbury, North Carolina. She wanted to tour Cannon Mills, and she was coming to a YWCA meeting at Livingston College. After touring Cannon Mills, she went to the meeting and she dined with black and white students. In the aftermath, not one white woman in Salisbury would host the First Lady overnight. She got on the train and went back to Washington, D.C. They said they couldn't host her because she dined in an interracial setting, and as such, she had insulted the whole state. I know, Enrique, you met a kind one, I think, at the University of Alabama. Her support for World War II soldiers was also suspect. In 1944, she attended the opening of a canteen, which is what they called social clubs for soldiers, in Washington, D.C. And it was sponsored and funded by the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, right? As a result, the congressman from the South condemned her for condoning interracial dancing. For weeks after, letters poured in from women and girls across the South accusing, and these are mostly middle-class women, right? These are not poor white women were writing Eleanor Roosevelt and asking if she would send her cast-off clothes. Right, middle-class, educated white women, some of them, were writing accusing Eleanor of breaking down racial segregation, of advocating interracial sex, and of supporting the breakdown of segregated schools. One 12-year-old girl from Rayville, Louisiana, wrote to the First Lady, "When I think of white girls dancing and associating with colored, and you're entertaining them at the White House, I am not able to put into words. And as if this meant integrated education, she claimed she would finish school at home." Right? We're 10 years before the Brown decision, and these are soldiers, but whatever. Just last week, I met a gentleman from Mississippi at Malaprops who told me that his sister cut out Eleanor Roosevelt's columns of the Jackson Clarion Ledger because she knew that her mother would cancel the paper if she ever read them. And she wanted to read the columns, so she would run to the mailbox, get the paper, and cut out that column every day so that her mother would not know that she was reading it. In 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt became the inaugural chair of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. So when Enrique was talking about the detention of these children at the border, and it seems so inhumane, in 1948, human rights was considered to be sort of a synonym for desegregation. And so across the nation, segregationists opposed human rights initiatives out of the United Nations because they thought they would threaten white supremacist politics. It did not help that Eleanor Roosevelt, who they'd been campaigning against for decades at this point, right, was the chairman of this commission. Some white women wrote in their columns in newspapers that the Human Rights Convention would prevent and punish any white person, right, who harmed an African American, because that would be a minority and they would be opposed to the Human Rights Convention, right, which was framed in this notion of genocide. Florence Sellers Ogden, who was this columnist, also said that the treaty would make it illegal to make derogatory statements about the NAACP, and she just could not stop doing that. So defending, in essence, lynching and vigilante violence, white women across the South and the nation condemned the United Nations for potential interference in national, state, and domestic affairs. Human rights, segregation supporters believed, meant the end to white supremacist rule. So what does all this have to do with the 14th Amendment? It helped, their efforts helped build opposition in the South, a region that had previously supported the United Nations more than any other region in the country. It mobilized people against international peacekeeping missions and against actions that condemned genocide. This suspicion of international efforts meant that the 14th Amendment rights winnowed for people that were coming to the United States, right, from these international locations. So the domestic version of this was a suspicion about expanding the rights of equality to those who were coming into this country. The other thing that the campaign against Eleanor Roosevelt did, right, the other two things it did, is it taught a lesson to potentially racially liberal white women, that they would be censored by their communities, right? That if Eleanor Roosevelt could, as the First Lady and then as a chairman in the United Nations, if she could suffer this kind of abuse, what kind of abuse do you think we could met out for our local betrayers of white supremacy? And the second thing, and I think this is even more important, is that it made Eleanor Roosevelt the sort of catalyst of civil rights activism. So white women were blaming another white woman for civil rights activism and erasing all the work that was being done by black men, women, and children in the South, right? So it took away any sort of agency and diminished the efforts of African Americans across the nation who were pushing really hard. It ignored the NAACP's efforts, right, and made Eleanor Roosevelt this sort of all-powerful person. So that's the first example. After the Brown decision in 1954 pronounced school desegregation unconstitutional, it took nearly 20 years at least for meaningful desegregation to occur in most places. It took longer in other places. In our own county, the Brown decision was announced in 1954. In 1956, a new black consolidated school opened, which is now the school board offices. Students attended that segregated school for 4 years until soft integration happened in 1963. And Jackson County was better than most in that sort of process. There were many ways to resist the Brown decision, right? To resist this Supreme Court decision, which might be important to remember, right? In a different way. Women stood outside school doors in New Orleans for a year chanting at Ruby Bridges. They vandalized neighbors' homes who continued to send their children to newly integrated schools. White women denied that the body that was found in Money, Mississippi was that of 14-year-old Emmett Till, and they accused the black press and Mamie Till of what we now call fake news. Organizations conducted essay contests like the one that was on the screen on the benefits of segregation, the prize, again, as I said, being the cost of college tuition. One approach adopted by a woman in South Carolina was to delegitimize the Supreme Court in the aftermath of the Brown decision. Cornelia Dabney Tucker had already conducted a nationwide campaign in 1938 to prevent the expansion of the Supreme Court when FDR wanted to appoint more than 9 justices. In the aftermath of the Brown decision and later in the Prayer in School decision, Tucker, a vehement segregationist, worked to build a grassroots campaign to delegitimize the Supreme Court justices, to shape the process so that the president would have less power than senators and states in the nomination process. Her solution was for every U.S. senator to submit a short list of candidates for federal judiciary appointments. So from the appellate court all the way up. And those appointments would need to be approved by the state's population, and then the president would have to choose the federal justices from those short lists. By seeming to focus on this really kind of wonky nomination process, Tucker buried her overt racial politics, and instead she sent out thousands and thousands of letters and pamphlets calling for people to lobby for a new nomination process for the Supreme Court. She also denounced the Brown decision as part of a communist worldwide conspiracy, which is kind of serious in the 60s, right? Because we're all worried. So it brought anti-communists into her fold. She said that the decision reflected the expansion of federal powers now into education, and that was the purview of the states. So those folks who had been lobbying for sort of states' rights could then come on to this attack on the Supreme Court. In her letters, she stressed that people should emphasize states' rights instead of a commitment to racial segregation, believing a more effective national campaign could be built by diminishing her sort of commitment to white supremacy. It worked. Tucker became enmeshed in far-right and right-wing circles. She presented her ideas at national meetings. Senator James Eastland, who was a segregationist from Mississippi and the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, had her distribute his speeches on the congressional floor across the nation. And again, she pointed to the court's desegregation decision as evidence of the March on Communism and of activist judges. The language of activist judges today is used, right, for left-leaning who people accuse of following their political whims rather than the Constitution. It is an outgrowth of Tucker's campaign, right, that emerged from her opposition to the Brown decision. Are you keeping my time?
You're doing okay.
Okay. This tactic, replacing white supremacist language with the language of sort of following the Constitution, grew over the 1960s as legal segregation fell, and the Voting Rights Act opened up the political system. These white segregationist women, however, did not just disappear. Retooling their politics, they formed groups like Women for Constitutional Government, Patriotic American Youth, Pro-America. That was in Pasadena and Seattle. Women for Constitutional Government was from Chicago throughout the Southeast. Patriotic American Youth was a national organization. These groups did much of the same kind of grassroots organizing that the segregationist women had done earlier. They made sure their followers got seats on school boards, on textbook commissions that approved textbooks for public schools. They conducted essay contests that stressed states' rights. They told their followers to oppose UNICEF. You know how kids trick or treat for UNICEF? Right, but that's very multicultural, so we can't do that. And the UN for promoting multicultural education because it diminished the achievements of America's original settlers. Right, which is in direct opposition to the idea of birthright citizenship and national citizenship articulated in the 14th Amendment. They worked to promote charter schools, dodging open public schools by pushing public money to be used in schools that served exclusive, not inclusive publics. They wrote pieces on how integrated schools harmed the academic achievement of white students. And interestingly, white women, far more than white men, feared that equal schooling would lead to marriage, to interracial marriage. Right? And when we hear about sort of lynching and violence, we think of sexual violence, of rape is the mantra that's often used. But for white women, they knew that it was not sexual violence that was the threat, it was interracial marriage, right? If people started going to school together, and so that was that was what they were obsessed about. By the time the courts issued their decision in Swan versus Mecklenburg in 1971 that permitted busing, segregationists had retooled their rhetoric and spread across the nation. They emphasized states' rights, opposition to an intrusive federal government, and began to discuss the rights of families to have free choice of their children's education. This exploded in the protest in 1974, not in the rural or urban South, but across the urban North and West. There, women, mothers, led the campaign to prevent their children from being bused. While they emphasized that they were unlike Southern segregationists, it's hard to look at their work and discern any difference. I don't know, can you get it to the end? They denied their racism and instead said what they believed in was choice. School choice became the clarion cry for those seeking to avoid school desegregation in Boston, Detroit, Pontiac, Michigan, Louisville, Kentucky. White women in Boston established an organization called ROAR, Restore Our Alienated Rights. Women invited in Boston the KKK and George Wallace into their homes to strategize about how to obstruct busing. Some women circled school playgrounds and yelled at students and teachers. Mothers put up flyers in school hallways calling on students to join neighborhood associations and to boycott their schools. They called protesters in North Carolina and South Carolina to see how they had avoided meaningful integration for so long. They pressured their neighbors into boycotting schools. One woman wrote to the judge cataloging all her efforts to defeat busing to desegregate the Boston schools. She said in 1 week she wrote 245 registered letters, attended a rally, delivered a speech, participated in a prayer protest, put signs on her car, ran the Home and School Association, distributed anti-busing signs at schools, conducted a phone tree, organized a motorcade, and kept her kids at home. She stressed that this had really hurt her diet, her sex life, which was non-existent, her housekeeping, and her daily hygiene. She simply no longer had time for baths. I admire all that she, not like her politics, but that's a pretty significant list, right? We could probably get some things changed if we did that every week. They earned the name anti-bussers, even as Black Bostonians would remind the public of the segregationist outcome of their protest. African Americans in Boston would remind people across the nation that it was not the bus that they were protesting, it was us. So their chant was, it's not the bus, it's us. So what do we make of these stories, right, 50 some years later? And what do they have to do with the 14th Amendment? It should remind us, if we need reminded, which I don't think we do, right, that the struggle for equality is met with constant challenges and that no victory is complete, nor is any defeat complete. It is our responsibility, as Professor Nagin Brown said, to redefine the 14th Amendment each generation. The struggle for equality happens in profound ways, and it happens in our local communities. It is there that segregationist women drew the color line in schools, controlled the history that their children learned, conducted get out the vote campaigns, and reminded their Sunday school students and their classrooms and their couples seeking marriage licenses, and praised in the PTA the benefits of racial segregation. We can adopt a different set of politics and still adopt the same strategies. Right? It is there, far below, it is in our local communities, far below national leaders, that the fight for equal justice and equal protection under the law must happen, in my opinion. If we are to think, if we are to make, sort of, draw any lessons from history, that the 14th Amendment is the cornerstone of our nation. And those people that are trying to abolish the 14th Amendment are not for the nation. Right? It created the nation. And we must also work in public welfare offices, in our public schools, in our school boards, with our county commissioners, in our precincts to shape our society. We must tell stories that highlight equality, that give voice and dignity to those who struggle, and that acknowledge that we are a nation, right, that is upheld and follows the 14th Amendment. We must acknowledge that many who shaped the system of white supremacy were deeply committed to a world where race determined opportunity, unequal opportunity. But we may also remember that that system was supported less consciously, perhaps, with less questions, by people who had grown up thinking that's just the way it was. It is those people, the progeny of folks who didn't ask the questions, who we must cultivate rather than demonize. Thank you.
About 20-minute time for questions. Everybody's okay.
Yes, I'm happy to answer any questions I can and defer others to a later time.
Is the paradigm switch to religion as being now the benchmark for white supremacy?
Would you talk a little more to me about that?
The churches that literally come out with a white supremacist message or support white supremacy,
I think
or
they
don't do anything.
Yeah, I think they did that then too, right? Like, as Martin Luther King said, right, 11 o'clock in the South, the most segregated hour, right? I still think our churches, so I think churches go both ways, right? You see, this is probably going to get me in trouble. I think in the
You won't get into trouble.
in the recent, I think evangelical Christianity has taken a huge hit in recent years because of their failure to speak out against what are sort of the violation of basic human rights and bearing part of a message that other Christians deem really vital. Yeah, and so I think that I read a piece a couple of months ago that was like, evangelicalism is no longer a religious identity, it's a political identity. So I read that. I didn't write it. But I think churches have a lot of power, too, to do a lot of good, right? Yes, ma'am.
I think, is it recognized that, I don't know how they are today, but I know like a number of years ago when I was growing up, your churches in the South, most of these guys were Klansmen. And they taught this. This is what they projected. This is what they supported.
Mm-hmm.
And this was in your so-called Christian churches,
Mm-hmm.
in all of them. This is what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so religion at that point was supporting white supremacy, that they were deeming it and telling people go out and hang him or go out and, I mean, this was the thing that was going on in your so-called Christian religions, which is why someone like me said no to
Right,
religion.
right, for sure, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
then on the flip side, right, the Black churches were where the catalyst for such activism also happened, right? So you have these competing definitions of Christianity, but I think it's also not the in the 40s and 50s and 60s, it's not the evangelical churches that are supporting Klansmen, it's the First Baptist and the First Methodist. It's the downtown churches, right, where people dressed up. Yeah. It was not, right, working class white churches that were the architects. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about several ways that they gathered together to make changes. Would you kind of think about what you think would be the top 2 or 3 for the group, all of us here and all of us that have a certain party affiliation? We need help in figuring out how to get people out to vote and to see how, excuse my language, god awful this country has become in the last year and a half.
Yeah, so I think I'm probably too old to comment on social media, but so I don't know, I can't sort of think about how that translates. I mean, I do think it builds coalitions, but I think it often remains so faceless that in local communities it's hard to cultivate, right? It's easy to spread news that way, it's hard to cultivate action that way. But right, I'm old and that's probably not true. But I do think the sort of constant pressure, right? Like, I know when I write a letter, and I write, I work at Western, so I write it under my kids' emails. So they're always getting updates from right-wing politicians on their email, because I'm afraid to do it at work. And so I think it feels like I'm just doing something that doesn't matter. But I think it mattered, right? Like, they worked all the time. And I think there's lots we can do in our communities, at the community level, that you can see change. And maybe that gives you enough hope to keep going. So I think so often when we focus on this big level, well, I'll segue. A couple years ago, I took students on the civil rights trip. Well, 2005, so a lot of years ago. And we met Hollis Watkins, who was the first Black Mississippian who worked for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he said, it's like taking down an elephant. You have to do it 1 inch at a time. Mm-hmm. And so he's like, you work where you are. So if you're in the public schools or you're interested in public education, then you need to work there. If you need to work in public welfare and public health offices. If you're good at getting people out to vote, you need to get people out to vote. And there's a lot of people in this community, a lot of older white folks who have limited means, that this latest legislation, right, in North Carolina really limited their ability to vote. I took a dear friend of mine who babysat my children like 5 times to try, and we never had the right documents. And she voted in every election since she was 18, and she's 83. And so I think, we can get out and take, I don't know. I mean, I wish, right? I'm a historian because I don't really know how to solve current problems, but it seems too overwhelming. But I do think that they worked at their local levels, right? I don't know. It's like, maybe we'll do an essay contest on why Trump shouldn't be president. I mean, I don't know, right? Like, and you get $500, right? People would write that essay. I don't know. Right? You'd have to be a little savvier than that, I think. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I teach in public schools. You touched on the charter schools, obviously, but in Macon County, I'm not sure if it's as big here. It probably is. In Jackson County, homeschooling. Oh. And the blinders that these kids have, they're with their parents who are evangelicals, and the social blinders, but also the arrogance and the confidence that the world is exactly 4,000 years old or whatever. Mm-hmm. The dinosaurs and Adam and Eve were hanging out together, and it goes downhill from there real fast.
Right. So, It is right? It is complicated. I don't think you're going to change people's minds about that. But do they want public health care, right? Maybe that's the inroad that you get. I think the problem for me, with charter schools is it's public money. So homeschool takes money out of the public coffers, but it doesn't deliver it to other public coffers, right? It doesn't deliver it. I mean, I couldn't homeschool. It would be where I would pay a lot not to homeschool my kids. And I love them, right? And it has, but and they would pay a lot for me not to homeschool them. So I think, like, homeschooling to me seems like a different public policy issue than charter schools, I guess would be the way I answered, because the public money that is funneled into those schools directly takes away, right, from our school, from what I think are our schools.
I was thinking in terms of socialization, because they've got these curriculums, these very, very right-wing curriculums, and so I'm almost to the point. I was too young for the draft, but I believe there almost needs to be some sort of national
public
something
service
for young people. It doesn't have to be military service. It could be AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, something, just to have a common sense set of principles, or sense of a national identity, certainly service, but also responsibility to each other as at least Americans, if not human beings.
Yeah. Yeah. We can talk about that later. Myrtle.
In your research, right when we had all this controversy about the Confederate soldier statues, I learned how white women were the ones that went around in the 50s and really got all those things put up. And I think it ties in so well with what you're talking about. And some of us are 80 and pushing 80, and we have relatives who are exactly like who you described. And so it is still very prevalent in the South.
Right.
And I think when you read the plaque on the Confederate statue in front of the old courthouse, it refers to mothers.
Yes, yeah. I think motherhood's really portable, right? And so I think we often think about motherhood as this lofty, like moral, like a moralistic position, and I think it's been used politically by all sides for both positive and negative. Yes, women were.
And it started with the women that were wealthy. They wanted to keep their kind of lifestyle,
right,
to elevate it. So it's all fake, for sure.
Yeah, and they got, early on in the 20s, women dominated the textbook commissions in the state, which again, right, who would ever go look at that? But they dictated what textbooks were used, and it meant that the South dictated the textbooks for the nation, because the South was the first area where states chose the textbooks, which meant that in a free market economy, that the textbook publishers, wherever they were, knew they would make more money by publishing those books. And so the whole nation ended up reading the books that the Georgia United Daughters of the Confederacy had gotten listed as approved. And that went on for generations.
Still in Texas.
Yeah, Texas does now, yeah.
Has been doing it for years, and Mifflin and all of those, if Texas wants something taken out, then they take it out because and they're not going to make any others because they can make enough money on that.
Right.
And it has so skewed what students have learned. I had a friend who had a child in Wisconsin, was discussing the World Civil War, moved to Georgia. They were talking about war. It was the same one, and the kid said, I had no idea it was the same. It was the war of northern aggression, and all that. It was totally different perspective of what they did, and so was the textbook she was reading.
Just don't read textbooks. Oh. Any other? Yes.
I did some volunteer reading teaching in local school, and one of the teachers, his social studies history teacher, had asked me to have one of her students in. And she asked me, one day she wanted me to come in the classroom. And I had to cover my mouth when I heard what was being taught. I had to cover my mouth because I was ready. I just started going a little crazy. I covered my mouth. And of course, in working with the young man that I was working with to teach him reading, I taught him some history. But to hear what these kids were being taught, and it to me was an amazement. And then the one African-American child that I saw in the school, I asked him a question about Malcolm X. He had no idea who it was. And that's what I began to realize, that parts of the country, people who live in certain places don't know what's going on outside of that area. And this is scary. This is dangerous because they don't even know what's going on in the next state or in another country. They don't have it. They don't know. This is what's really scary.
There's so much that's scary.
That's the things to the young people. That's
Yeah.
I want to say now too. I want to say something and ask something. One is, and this is not. I have read Elizabeth's book, and as you were so gracious to say several times, of course we know this. Of course we know this. And I read your book. Well, I didn't realize that white women of that, middle and upper class were so involved. But I thought, well, oh yeah, I'm going to get a lot of this. And I want to say, it was the most jaw-dropping reading experience I've ever had. And I thought I was kind of thought I was in with this. And I had no idea. So there's that. And the other thing is, it ties in with Barbara's terrific question of what can we do. And I also began to think as I was reading this book, it's like a guidebook for political activism at the ground level. And I began to think, that's what we could be doing here. That's what we could be doing here. As you said at the end, not for the same purposes at all, but those are strategies we could consider today, even in social media zone, because maybe that does not help in every context. So that sounds like a commercial or like, y'all go get this book, but I tell everybody I can, please read this book. Even if you can buy a copy and share it among 5 or 10 people and say, y'all, let's read this and think about this. It is so meaningful for helping us go about what we are trying to go about. That's my testament.
that.
From the heart. The question I want to ask is, given the context of us being here to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment and all the knowledge you bring to that and the historical perspectives and how difficult it is to maintain the purity and dignity of that amendment, is there anything you would point us to as we continue, I don't know, between now and the end of 2018 or now and a year from now? Is there something that particularly is of concern to you that's chipping away at the 14th Amendment? And in that way, maybe, is there something you would direct us at the local level to pay attention to?
Well, I think this NAACP in the state of North, I think the taking away of the vote from people is really horrifying. On the way over, Lucy was like, don't you just get to vote? Isn't that right? And I was like, it should be, right? It should be that you get to vote. And so I think in North Carolina in particular, it is probably the battle is the vote. But I also think that support of public education is a really critical battle. And not that it's not that everything in public education is going right, but I think the more we're involved in public education and the more we support public education, the better that institution. And that war has been waged against by the right for a while, for 40, 50 years.
I want it to be barefoot and
So, as a plug for Jackson County Schools, Enrique mentioned, and I wrote it, that Alec Macaulay and I do this Appalachian Oral History Project, and we've interviewed Mr. Baker, and Lucy's getting ready to interview Miss Inabinet. But if any of you all, and I've talked to some of you tonight, we've interviewed Mary Sue Casey and Reverend Charles Lee, and so every year we train about 15 high school kids to go out into the community and record the stories of people all, I mean, we did Satara Graff and Reed and Henry Cornegay, who, was like 25. And so if anyone's interested in having, in talking to students and having their stories told, we do this every spring, and I would love to get your information. If all of you volunteer, we can't get you all done next spring, but so I think in one way that's been a really important way for the students to recognize sort of the breadth of their community. We interviewed Armando Acosta, who some of you might know, at Bryson Farm Supply, and Randy Hooper last year, and so I think it's a way to sort of get students to recognize, right, the experiences of people in the community. So that has nothing to do with my book, but that is a way I could harness some of you all to that project. So I'm happy to take your names. Anyway.
All right. Let's give Dr. McCrae a hand. Thank you so much.